Good afternoon, class. Welcome back. This is the second week of Introduction to Religious Studies, and we are focusing on the early anthropologists, particularly E.B. Tylor, James Frazer, and E. Evans-Pritchard. And today I wanted to draw some distinctions, or rather comment on some of the distinctions they draw between religion, magic, and science. And in doing that, I'll also address the philosophical concepts of a coherence epistemology, a correspondence epistemology, and we'll look at some aspects of a pragmatic epistemology. And part of one of the short response questions is to sort of look at different epistemological systems that these anthropologists have while looking at some of the distinctions they make between religion, magic, and science. So we'll begin with E.B. Tylor. And for this purpose, James Frazer is essentially a disciple of E.B. Tylor. He changes certain things and his work builds upon the work of Tylor's, but for the most part, he will not deviate from Tylor's framework. E.B. Tylor um, thought that all religion originates from animism, and animism is a belief that there are sort of spirits, animating spirits in objects, and that's what causes change, and that's what causes a distinction, that's what causes life and movement in these spirits, in these objects. So a tree, for example, would have an animating spirit, and if the tree dies, one might say, oh, the animating spirit has left the tree. The same way a river that's sort of rushing, the water's rushing in the river, it might have an animating spirit. And when the river dries up, the spirit may have left. Same with a rock falling. It's due to the animating spirit, and so on and so forth. And he thought that this is where religion originated. A lot of these early anthropologists, and not just anthropologists, early sociologists like Durkheim, um, Max Mueller's also trying to solve this problem. They're trying to ask themselves, how did a religion originate? What made individuals um, uh, um, or groups of people begin to believe in religion? Where did it come from? And so E.B. Tylor is going to say it originated in animism, and it originated in this idea that people were trying to explain change. What is the difference between a living body and a dead body? What is the difference between the sleeping state and the waking state? And so this idea of animism is what he suggests the early individuals thought. Now, at this time, he had his first works in 1871. At this time, Darwin's notion of evolution is coming about, and the people of the time don't really know the scope of the idea. And so there's this other idea called evolutionism, in which they think that evolution means change or progress for the betterment, as opposed to just random mutation and adaptation, right? So they think there's a goal in mind, and that this notion of evolutionism also they think might apply to other aspects. So morality, intellectuality, reason, right? So you can have evolved in quotes, right? It's not evolved. It's changing, but it's not progressing, right? And so you have different forms of evolution, um, and spirituality and belief systems are no exception from this notion of evolutionism. And so E.B. Tylor is a subscriber to this idea, and he's looking through history, and he's sort of seeing and suggesting to himself and to his audience that over time beliefs sort of evolve, but in that notion of evolutionism, not in the way we use the term evolve today. That we might just say, again, not agreeing with him, but trying to express it in his words, progressed. So the notion of religious belief progressed from animism, that was the origin, to polytheism. That'll be the second stage. to monotheism, the third stage. So individuals and groups of peoples over time and place uh, formed early beliefs in animism, and then that changed, but with a progressive notion in Tylor's framework to um, polytheism, which changed to monotheism, and finally it reached its corrective stage in science. And what he means by corrective stage is that the explanation for change that these people thought of in animism was ultimately false. And because, as he suggests, and in some of the PowerPoints, I pull out the key passages where he says animism is a grand mistake. The reason that change happens isn't that animating spirits are in things, and therefore, because religion had its origin in animism, the polytheism is also wrong, the monotheism is also wrong, and we finally reach a corrective way of looking at the world in science. So this is E.B. Tylor's early theory. It's somewhat arbitrary if you were reading it and you say, well, that just seems like a uh, a a grand mistake in and of itself. That theory is rather arbitrary, is rather partial in a lot of ways. It's not really well researched. He has a few beliefs. One is that he can try to understand other peoples simply by introspecting, and later. Sociologist past Durkheim will say, well, that's not really correct. You have to understand a society before you can try to introspect and say, why would another person do this? The E. Evans-Pritchard, he calls this the if I were a horse fallacy, right? You see a horse do something and you say, well, if I was a horse, this is why I would do it. And this is what is known as the intellectual approach in the Pals text, but it's a very superficial approach and bound to error. So before you can begin to understand the actions of individuals, the later early anthropologists such as E. Evans-Pritchard will say, among other things, you have to understand the society. That would mean doing field work, working with peoples, trying to understand their history, their customs, their culture, and only then can you begin to give explanations for why they do things. You can't just sit back in the armchair and say, well, if I were this individual, this is why I would do things. Known as the armchair anthropologist. So we also get the first type of epistemology, and this is a correspondence epistemology. E.B. Tylor holds a correspondence epistemology, and this means that knowledge is considered knowledge if it corresponds to the way the world is. And this is why he was able to sort of say in his own frame of mind, science it gives us a correct way of understanding the world, and that's why it is right, according to E.B. Tylor. Whereas religion and magic, whether it's animism, polytheism, monotheism, ultimately gives us a way of understanding the world that's incorrect. They aren't animating spirits, according to E.B. Tylor. There aren't a plethora of gods, according to him, and polytheism, and there's not a one God either, according to him. So these systems of knowing are incorrect, according to E.B. Tylor's correspondence epistemology, because they do not give us an accurate depiction of the way the world is. Now, the next anthropologist, James Frazer, kind of picks up where Tylor leaves off. Tylor doesn't necessarily see a distinction between magic and religion. Magic for him would probably fall into the category of animism, whereas religion would fall under the category of polytheism and monotheism. And there might be interesting distinctions there, but he sees it as different progressions of the same thing. Um, Frazer sees one practical distinction between religion and magic. Frazer sees magic as what he calls a prototypical science, and the example of a rain dance is used. And he says basically, according to magic, if you do a rain dance, it should rain. And if it doesn't rain, there's a problem. Why would you still do a rain dance or believe in magic if when you did the magical rain dance, it didn't rain? And this is a difficulty that both Tylor and Frazer have when trying to explain the question, why do people believe magic if, according in their words, they say it's obviously false, false epistemologically in the sense that it doesn't correspond to the way the world actually is in their frame of mind. There's nothing about a dance um, that makes rain happen according to their worldview, right? And so Frazer has one different distinction. He says this isn't the case with religion. With religion, there's a God involved, whether it's polytheistic or monotheistic. And instead of doing magical things to try to produce effects in the world for your benefit, what you do is you ask this God or these gods to have your will occur. And so you're not doing a magical formula to manipulate the world such for your benefit. You're asking a God sort of as a mediating role to let your wish be granted, so to speak. And the God can be capricious. They can do it or they cannot do it, depending on how they feel. And so a person, according to Frazer, might still believe in the God and think that everything about their religion is true, but they might think, oh, I didn't ask the God correctly. The God may have wanted to grant my wish, but then decided not to. The God has a capricious aspect. And so one can keep believing in religion, even though they don't get the results from what they want out of the religion. And this he thinks is distinctly different from magic. Because in magic, if you do the magical ritual right, the actual empirical results or change in the world should happen. And then when it doesn't, and they both think it doesn't because it doesn't reflect the way reality is, they wonder, well, why do people keep doing this, keep practicing magic? Okay, now the third anthropologist we're looking at is E. Evans-Pritchard, and he is different from the former two in the fact that he himself does field work. He goes and works with particular peoples whose religious belief and history and worldview is quite different from his own. He learns their language, he learns aspects of their custom and history, and he tries to make observations there. The first group of individuals he works with are the Azande people in South Sudan, and they practice a variety of magical and witchcraft rituals, particularly with the poison oracle. And if you want to look at this further, I did put a video on E. Evans Pritchard's where they do show the poison oracle ritual. So he works with these people. Earlier anthropologists, one of the answers that they gave as to why people believe in religion and magic when it's obviously false is that they're childish or irrational, and he found that this explanation was completely false. He didn't believe that any people or groups of people were logically inferior to any other group of people. He just assumed that he dismissed that premise outright. And so he says, no, it's not that. It has to be another reason why people would continue to believe in magic. Um, he experienced a lot of interesting, what we might call cognitive dissonance, but he would categorize it in an interesting way. He says, I obviously, when I'm in his um, teaching place of Oxford, when I'm there in Oxford, I do not believe in magic. I don't necessarily, or witchcraft. I don't think it exists. But when I'm existing with this other group of individuals who do, it seems as though I do believe it. It does seem real here, but when I go back home, it does not seem real. And so he's going to try to organize truth in a completely different way. He's not looking at correspondence, right? He doesn't ask Does it correspond to reality? In one way, he doesn't feel we can do that, particularly with things like religious belief. Religious belief helps us, according to him, make sense of the world. And only when we have a certain framework, what he would say is a coherent framework. And this brings us to our second form of epistemology, coherence epistemology. Only when we have a coherent framework or a coherent web of beliefs are we able to look at the world and actually start to make sense of it. And then we start to see the empirical world, right? But we're already seeing it through a coherent framework. Without a coherent framework or web of beliefs, observation would be impossible. One analogy often used is the dictionary, right? The dictionary is a coherent framework, but you need to know certain words in the dictionary before you can actually understand any definition, because every definition is made up of words which themselves are made up of other words that need to be defined using other words. And so, could a dictionary be referring to nothing but itself? In one sense, there is that coherent framework. We also explained that it refers to the words are symbols which refer or correspond to a reality. But before they can do it, they have to have some internal coherence. And so he is going to look at systems of knowledge as though they were coherent. And in coherence epistemologies or webs of belief, um, there are both important webs of beliefs or systems of beliefs and rather trivial. So think of it, I'm going to draw something and show you. Think of it, let me put that here, as a web here. And at the core of the web of belief, we have the most important beliefs, your core beliefs. And here we have what we might call the superficial beliefs, right? And so here, I'm going to put this down in a second. But we take a superficial belief. One of my favorite ones is suppose I'm going to class, going to teach, and I park in a parking lot. And a superficial belief might be, oh, I parked in this parking lot, in this one parking spot. And then when I go out, uh, when I'm leaving to go home, I don't see my car there. And then I look at in another lot and I see it there. I say, oh, okay. And so it was very easy for me to change that belief, right? For a moment, the beliefs didn't cohere. I had one belief that said, I parked in this parking lot, and then I see another observation that the car's not there. Now, I could have immediately said, I know that I parked in that parking lot. Someone must have stolen my car. And then I could have gone to like a conspiracy theory. When I saw my car parked in the other parking lot, I said, oh, I know I parked there. Someone must have taken my car and moved my car to the other lot. Now, that sounds crazy, but if it was very important for me to believe that, then I would have had to rearrange my web of beliefs in order to make sense of that belief I had that I parked my car where I did. Now, the core beliefs, if we go back to the system, the beliefs that are right at the center, if we change those beliefs, it causes such a disorganization to our web of beliefs that we might not even have the same worldview anymore. And I'll give a example of that. Suppose instead of not knowing where I parked my car, suppose I go home to my house, which I'd lived there for over 20 years, and I knock on the door, or I go to open the door, and another family's living there, and they say, "This isn't your house. This is our house. We've lived there for 20 years," and now I'm just sort of baffled. Like, am I crazy? What has gone on? Where are all my memories for the past 20 years, right? And so this would be a belief that I couldn't just sort of rearrange really quickly like I did with the car. Uh, with that notion of, oh, I thought I've lived someplace for 20 years and now I'm meeting conflicting evidence. I can't just simply quickly rearrange my web of beliefs. In reality, the web of beliefs with that particular one would basically crumble as how I don't know who I am, I don't know what I've been doing for 20 years, and so on and so forth. Where are my possessions? Where are my pets? Where are these things, right? And so this is a coherence. form of beliefs. Now, when we ask, and what's been suggested by Daniel Powell's in the Powell's text, and by extension, what Evans-Pritchard suggests is there are certain beliefs that every um, um, society has that are too precious to give up or to challenge. And for the Azande people that Evans-Pritchard was working with, and then what you're reading, the secondary text interpreted by Daniel Powell, it's suggested in that text that the belief in witchcraft, magic, the poison oracle is one such belief, and built into the systematic practice is a sort of safeguard so that that belief is never fully challenged, right? So if the poison oracle gives a false reading, there's always other explanations, such as someone else was using different magic or reason. But the idea that witchcraft and magic, and in this case oracles or divination, is false is never challenged in such a way that those beliefs would crumble and the worldview would be left um, with not being able to be rearranged. And so Evans-Pritchard has a coherence approach. It's been argued, particularly in the Powell's text, to knowledge. One is not saying that it corresponds to the way the world actually is. The coherence epistemology itself will argue that that's never an epistemological possibility. We can't just say this is how the universe is. Um, Tom Nagel calls that a view from nowhere. Hilary Putnam calls that the perspective of the universe. Sometimes we call that um, the view of God. We can never really know with certainty how the world is or what is corresponding. We can only look at it through our frame of reference. And the coherence epistemology says that our belief primarily doesn't show us how to correspond to the world, but rather it makes sense of all our other beliefs. And if this belief can make sense of all our other beliefs, then it is true in the sense that it coheres our beliefs. And this is what religious belief and beliefs in magic are to E. Evans-Pritchard. And he himself does not distinguish religion from magic. If anything, he suggests that they are, by and large, the same types of activity, except that religion is sort of seen in a positive light and magic is sort of seen as a negative light. So if you wanted to criticize it, you might something that is religious or that's this phenomenon in nature, you might call it magic. And if you wanted to sort of praise it, you might call it religion. But in reality, um, those two things are not conceptually different in E. Evans-Pritchard mind. Now, one of the things for this question, what happens to science in a coherence epistemological view? And this is something that many will argue E. Evans-Pritchard doesn't satisfy. E, although we're reading about theorists of religion, E. Evans-Pritchard doesn't necessarily give an overarching theory. This is again a criticism of his. But what is seen with science, or what can we make sense of with science and the knowledge science brings in a coherent framework? Because science, it would seem at least, takes a correspondence view of the world. Most philosophers of science would argue, some would perhaps argue against that. The most famous, Thomas Kuhn, in his Structures of Scientific Revolution. So I hope that helps with the three anthropologists, E.B. Tylor, James Frazer, and Evans-Pritchard. The third form of epistemology is pragmatism. And this, for the individuals we'll be reading, is most relevant to William James, and we'll get to that in the following week. But pragmatism is from the Greek word pragma, which means action. And it essentially explains that beliefs are true in that they produce certain actions. And a belief is different from another belief if they will produce different actions. Right? And so, for now, although we'll get into this much more next week, that can be the distinction there. has to do with action, right? So if someone says, "Well, I believe that the world was created by a creator God," and another person says, "Well, I believe that the universe was eternal and there was no creator; it just always existed." A pragmatist might say, "Well, suppose you believe one, and suppose you believe the other. Does that cause you to act any differently, right? If believing the universe was created by a creator God is one belief, and believing the universe is eternal is another, and those two beliefs don't cause any different action, then according to a pragmatist, they're the same belief, right? Because there's no difference in action. It has to do with action. It's not coherence and it's not correspondence to where the world is. It's how that belief causes action. Okay, so I hope that this video helps. I know it went a bit long, but there was quite a bit of information to cover. It may help in the early anthropologist discussion, and it may also help in the and it will definitely help in the short response, our first short response paper. All right, take care, and I will hope to speak to you all over Canvas or email later this week.